Jake Hanley had been a trucker for nearly 2 decades. The long stretches of solitude on the open road suited him just fine. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of his rig and the hum of the engine. But on one fateful night, as he drove along a desolate stretch of highway in the deep south, Jake's life would change forever. It was a moonless night, the kind where the darkness felt alive, pressing against the windows of the truck cab. Jake was on his way to make a delivery in a small town, miles away from the nearest sign of civilization. The road was narrow, winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around him. The silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a nocturnal animal. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside, thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Jake never picked up strangers, but something about this man was different. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a tattered suit that looked out of place in the modern world. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, those eyes were dark and hollow, filled with a sorrow that Jake couldn't ignore. Against his better judgment, Jake slowed down and pulled over. The hitchhiker climbed into the cab without a word, his presence sending a chill through the air. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to break the eerie silence. The man turned to him, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "Just down the road. Not far." They drove in silence, the air thick with tension. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hitchhiker's eyes never left the road ahead, and every so often Jake thought he saw the man's lips move, as if he were muttering something under his breath. But when he strained to listen, he heard nothing but the hum of the engine. After what felt like an eternity, the hitchhiker spoke again. "Stop here," he said, pointing to a clearing on the side of the road. Jake hesitated, but did as he was told. The hitchhiker opened the door and stepped out, but before he could close it, he turned to Jake. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice laced with something that sounded like sorrow, or perhaps relief. Jake watched as the man walked into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. A sense of dread settled over him as he realized something was off. He looked down at the seat where the hitchhiker had been sitting and saw something that made his blood run cold. The seat was damp, as if the man had been sitting in water, and a musty, rotten smell filled the cab. Shaken, Jake slammed the door and drove off, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to put as much distance between himself and that clearing as possible. But the road seemed endless, and the trees loomed ever closer, their branches scratching at the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jake saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. He pulled in, desperate for some human contact, some reassurance that he wasn't losing his mind. The attendant was an old man with a weathered face and a knowing look in his eyes. Jake told him about the hitchhiker, the damp seat, the smell. The old man listened quietly, then nodded. "You ain't the first," he said, his voice tinged with a strange mix of fear and resignation. "That man, he's been dead for over 50 years, drowned in a flood not far from here, but his spirit, it never left." Jake's blood ran cold. He had heard stories of ghostly hitchhikers, but he had never believed them, until now. He left the gas station in a daze, his mind racing. He never spoke of that night again, but he couldn't escape the feeling that he had come dangerously close to something beyond the realm of the living. And every time he drove down that stretch of road, he made sure to keep his eyes straight ahead, never looking to the side, just in case. It was the middle of the night, and Jerry Mason was exhausted. He had been driving for over 16 hours, pushing himself to make a tight delivery deadline. The road had been long and lonely, and the shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to stretch endlessly across the asphalt. His eyes were heavy, and he knew he needed to rest before he caused an accident. He spotted a rest stop sign up ahead and decided to pull over. The place was deserted, as most rest stops were at this hour. Jerry parked his truck, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the nearby trees and the distant chirping of crickets. As he walked toward the restroom, Jerry noticed something strange. The lights in the building flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if something unseen was watching him. He shook off the feeling, blaming it on his exhaustion, and pushed open the door. The restroom was old and poorly maintained, with cracked tiles and a lingering smell of mildew. Jerry quickly used the facilities, eager to get back to his truck and catch a few hours of sleep. But as he washed his hands, he heard something that made him freeze. It was a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from one of the stalls. "Help me," the voice said, filled with desperation and fear. Jerry's blood ran cold. He had thought he was alone. Cautiously, he approached the stall, his pulse racing. The door was ajar, and he could see the outline of a figure inside. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. There was no response, just that same desperate whisper. "Help me." Jerry pushed the door open, and what he saw made his stomach churn. The stall was empty, but the walls were covered in dark, sticky smears. The words, "Help me," were scrawled across the tiles in what looked like blood. The air grew colder, and Jerry felt a presence behind him, as if someone, or something, was standing right there. He spun around, but the restroom was empty. Panic surged through him, and he bolted for the door. As he reached for the handle, the lights flickered again, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Don't leave me," they begged, echoing through the room. Jerry burst out of the restroom and ran back to his truck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He jumped into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw something that nearly made his heart stop. There, standing in the shadows by the restroom, was a figure. It was the silhouette of a woman, her face hidden in darkness, but her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. He floored the gas pedal, desperate to get away. The truck roared to life, and he sped out of the rest stop, not daring to look back. But as he drove, the whispers followed him, growing fainter but never quite fading away. "Help me. Don't leave me." Jerry didn't stop until he reached a truck stop several miles down the road. He pulled into the lot, his hands shaking, and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He knew one thing for sure. He would never stop at that rest stop again. Later, he heard stories from other truckers about that place. They all spoke of strange occurrences, ghostly sightings, and the tragic tale of a young woman who had been murdered there years ago. Her body was never found, but her spirit was said to haunt the rest stop, forever searching for someone to help her. Jerry couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something truly horrifying that night. And every time he passed that stretch of road, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine, as if the ghostly whispers were still following him, begging for help that he could never give. Route 66, the Mother Road, was once a bustling highway that connected the heart of America. But by the time Martin O'Hara started trucking, much of it had fallen into disrepair, replaced by faster, more efficient routes. Still, parts of it remained in use, especially by truckers who knew its shortcuts and secrets. Martin had always loved the freedom of the open road, but there was one section of Route 66 that he dreaded. It was an isolated stretch that cut through the desert, far from any towns or signs of life. The locals called it the Devil's Backbone, and it had a dark reputation. One summer night, Martin found himself driving down that very road. The sky was clear, the stars bright against the blackness, but the desert wind was fierce, howling like a pack of wild animals. As he drove, He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his skin prickled with unease. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But as he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated something that made his heart skip a beat. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, a tall, gaunt man dressed in tattered clothes. His eyes were wide and wild, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Martin slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the man. But when he looked again, the road was empty. The figure had vanished as if he had never been there. Martin's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe he was more tired than he realized. Shaken, he continued driving, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. The wind howled louder, and strange shapes seemed to dance in the shadows at the edge of his vision. He knew he needed to pull over and rest, but the thought of stopping on this cursed stretch of road filled him with terror. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, even though it had been off. A voice came through, faint and distorted, as if from a great distance. "Help me, please," it pleaded, the words filled with despair. Martin's blood ran cold. He hadn't touched the radio, and the voice was like nothing he had ever heard. Panic set in as the truck's engine began to sputter and the headlights flickered. Martin desperately tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The truck coasted to a stop, the desert silence closing in around him. The voice on the radio continued to plead, growing more frantic with each passing second. "Help me. They're coming." Martin's heart raced as he scanned the dark desert around him. He could see nothing but endless shadows, but he could feel something out there, something malevolent closing in on him. The air grew thick with a foul stench, like rotting flesh, and he could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. He locked the doors and grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the darkness. The beam of light revealed nothing but the empty desert, yet the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. The radio crackled again, and the voice screamed, "They're here!" In a panic, Martin honked the truck's horn, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. But the sound echoed hollowly in the vast emptiness, offering no comfort. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a loud thud rocked the truck, as if something had slammed into the side of the cab. Martin spun around, shining the flashlight on the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Pressed against the glass was the face of the gaunt man from the road, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire, his grin wider and more twisted than before. He pounded on the glass with inhuman strength, his mouth moving rapidly as if he were shouting, but no sound came through. Martin screamed and scrambled for his phone, but there was no signal. The truck's interior lights flickered, and the engine roared to life on its own, the truck lurching forward as if possessed. The man's face disappeared from the window, and the radio crackled once more, the voice now calm and eerie. "You can't escape. You're one of us now." The truck sped down the road, the steering wheel jerking in Martin's hands as if guided by an unseen force. The desert landscape blurred around him, and the temperature inside the cab plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and Martin's breath came out in visible puffs, even as he fought to regain control of the truck. Just when he thought he would crash, the truck skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. The radio went silent, the engine died, and the lights flickered out. Martin sat there, trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He waited for what felt like hours before he dared to move. When he finally stepped out of the truck, the desert was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that night haunted him, and he knew he would never be the same. He later learned that many truckers had experienced strange and terrifying encounters on that stretch of Route 66, and some had even disappeared without a trace. The Devil's Backbone was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and once you entered, you might never return. Martin vowed never to drive that road again, but the nightmares never stopped. And sometimes, When he was alone in his truck at night, he could still hear the voice on the radio whispering, "You can't escape. You're one of us now."